And the source that we rely on for the fundamental teachings of the Buddha is a set of texts that are called the Nikayas. Nikaya means a collection, and these are collections of suttas. The word sutta is a discourse of the Buddha. And so the discourses of the Buddha were collected very shortly after his passing away, and collected and then incorporated into these collections called Nikayas. And there have been different transmissions of these early Buddhist discourses in different countries, in different languages. But fortunately, we have a version of the early Buddhist discourses preserved in a language which would be very close to the language that the Buddha himself spoke, languages. And his discourses are now preserved in a language which is related to those North Indian languages, and that language is called Pali. Yeah, there are counterparts to these discourses preserved in Pali that had been transmitted to China during the early centuries when Buddhism moved from India to China and translated into Chinese. Later in India, the discourses were translated into the literary form of Sanskrit. Some have been preserved in Tibetan translation. And so we can compare these different versions of the discourses, and what we find, even though there are some differences in formulation and organization, but there's an astonishing amount of agreement among the different versions of these discourses. And so scholars have with a fair degree of certainty, have come to the conclusion that these discourses come as close as we can come to the actual discourses of the Buddha. The Buddha himself didn't write anything down. The teachings were transmitted was through oral discourse, the Buddha speaking, and his disciples, having listened to the discourse, would memorize the teachings. And so the Buddha's disciples would have listened to the discourses, and they were probably organized into teams with a responsibility for remembering the discourses and then teaching them to their own students. And in this way, the teachings had been passed on from one generation of monks to the next generation. And shortly after the Buddha passed away, his foremost disciples met. It's said that 3 months or 6 months after his passing away, they met in a kind of conference, a large conference, and they compiled the discourses of the Buddha and arranged them into these collections. Okay, so I'm explaining this just to make clear what I'm going to be covering in this course. So I'm not trying to cover Buddhism in its entirety, but the fundamental teachings of the Buddha, the teachings that in greatest likelihood come from the Buddha himself. And these teachings are derived from these collections called Nikayas. And the individual discourses and the Nikayas are the suttas. Okay, so first, the word Buddha. The word Buddha is not a proper name, but it is an honorific title. And it's the title which is given to the historical founder of Buddhism. And the word Buddha comes from the verb bujati, which means to understand, to comprehend. And so the Buddha is one who has understood, who is comprehended, I would say, like the deepest truths of existence,